Welcome to another Watercolours with Caroline in the series about waterworks and painting water. This week we're going to paint a very old wooden water wheel. The photos by Susan Rogier, and she so kindly let me use her photographs. She takes some beautiful photographs, so thank you, Susan, you've been so generous. It's going to be a long one. This is quite detailed. We have some wet in wet rhododendrons in the foreground and all of the background to do, so get ready to take a couple of days maybe on this one. You may need to pause it and come back to it. I'm working on 8" by 10" paper. I cut it bigger. I cut it 9 inches by 11 inches so that I had some extra to stretch the paper. I like working on stretched paper for bigger paintings, and I'll show you how to take your stretched paper off the board at the very end. So if you want to flip right forward to the very end to see how that's done, you can. So come on, let's get your paint and get your paper ready, and we'll paint this water wheel. And before we start the painting, I want to go over how I did the flowers on this rhododendron, because it's very, very loose, wet in wet, and it's something we may not really have done yet. But it does give a very lovely effect. If you don't want to paint every single, floret on the rhododendron, and they're very difficult because they're kind of wilted, some of them are fairly open. This one's fairly easy to paint, but I was thinking we'd just go for a more wet in wet look. And mine's just a wet in wet look. I haven't really done much detail on the florets. So we'll go over how I did that to start with. I've got a little bit of test paper. And I was also working on how to do those really light leaves. I did some of these just with yellow on its own and letting a little bit of the green bleed into it, because when you look at these really, really light leaves with the sun shining through them, they are extremely yellow, and then they have this kind of tinge of green. Of course, these are all the darker green leaves back here. And what looks nice is these very bright yellow ones against the brown water. So we're going for those sorts of contrasts. And let's see what we got here. This is my first one that was a mess, horrible mess. I didn't stretch the paper. It got all buckled, it bled. I tried to combine 2 photos and that didn't really work. So that one's a mess. This one turned out a bit better, but I do think the trees behind these background trees needed to be a lot darker. And I didn't really realize that till I'd taken the paper off of the board, and it was a bit late to darken them up then. But we'll try and go for either getting it dark in the first layer or adding a bit of a second layer, because I really think we need that lovely dark green behind the pink. But if you can't get that, I think it still looks okay with the lighter green. So we'll see what we can do. So let's now you can either watch how I did these little flowers, or you can practice on a piece of scrap paper if you like. I've just got a little piece of paper here, and I was trying different colors because I knew you may not have the Quinacridone Magenta. Not everybody does, and it's quite some of the colors are expensive. You don't get them in the cheaper paints. So what I did for these was pretty loose. Where I have the flowers, I wet just the flower areas, and I don't have anything drawn on here, so you can't really get any idea of what I'm doing. But then I didn't have anything drawn on here either, so it was now the paint that you get to put in that water has to be pretty thick and undiluted. So this is my Quinacridone Magenta, and instead of mixing it in my palette like I always do, I'm just on the tip of my wet brush getting a nice amount of concentrated paint. And I have to tilt my head to see where I've made that wet. And then I'm going to just touch that in the center of the area that I've just wet. And Quinacridone Magenta does that best thing at flowing. And if, say, there was another floret over here where I've got no water, I just maneuvered that a little bit with some water. I didn't have any there. I'll make another little floret here with a bit of water. A small brush, I've got my number 4, you could use a number 2, and again, very concentrated paint. I'm just going to touch it onto that wet area and it will kind of flow. I want to leave some white showing, and you can fill in, I filled in some of this area later with a little bit darker here just to give a little bit of dimension to it. A little bit of paint, a little bit of water, a bit of extra. Now, if you don't have Quinacridone Magenta, there's a lot of other colours I've used on here. Quinacridone Rose looks lovely. Let's just put a little bit of Quinacridone Rose. Again, I'm not diluting it, I'm just grabbing it off of the palette without diluting it. Now you'll see that the Quinacridone Rose doesn't spread out into the water just like the magenta did. Get a bit more. Let's try and get it flowing. See, it just doesn't want to flow like the other one did. I've got very wet there, but I can use water to kind of tease it out a little bit into a flowery shape. I also tried alizarin crimson. I tried some Quinacridone Rose with cobalt blue to make it a bit more like a magenta. And of course I have to do a little bit of mixing with that. Let's make another wet floret here. And this is my rose and blue mix to make more of a kind of magenta color. And I'm just maneuvering that. I'm having to maneuver these with a wet brush. And one more that you might want to make for the lighter petals is raw sienna with your rose or with your magenta. So because some of the petals are, you know, when they start to go a little bit brown, I'm just going to do one of those. So I'm going to mix my rose with a little bit of raw sienna. Very concentrated, not much water. I've mixed it with a little bit of raw sienna, and that gives it that sort of color where they start to go a little bit brown. And I can take some raw sienna by itself and just add a little bit of that to the edge of where the petals might be. And we can leave a lot of white on those flowers. So, and you can see they're very, very wet in wet. Not much shape. They will create a shape, and then when they've created a shape, you can go back and you can work on that shape to make it more floral when it's dry. Trust the process. Now for those leaves, for my directions, I've said mix yellow and phthalo green. So here I've got some yellow and some phthalo green. You certainly don't need much. Oh my goodness, that's too much already, because it has to be very, very yellow. And that makes a really, even with a little bit of green, it makes it very green. So what I was experimenting with while I was waiting to start was I got some of my Azo Yellow and a little bit of my Gamboge, which is more of an orange yellow, to get a warmer yellow. Mix the two of them. And I did the leaf just with the orangey yellow. And then I got some of that bright green that I mixed with the phthalo green and the yellow, and I just touched it to the end of that yellow and just let it kind of flood into it a little bit. And that seemed to make, for some of the bright leaves, it just seemed to make a more realistic look, because these are so yellowy green, and you can kind of see that the green is bleeding up into them. And I'm going to take a little bit of that green, a little bit of sap, and even if I did a stalk coming up there, it would continue to sort of bleed in a little bit and give that greeny look to it. So I don't have a lot of that written down in the directions, and you can sort of work on it as we go along, but I do think I'm just adding a bit of water to those just to make them a bit lighter. I do think I'm going to work with some of those leaves with yellow and letting the green flood in, but not straight away. The first thing we're going to do is try and figure out what parts of the drawing are flowers and what parts of the drawing are leaves and other things. And we really need to have, if you've got any kind of a photo close by on your phone or on your iPad, or I print mine out on a big piece of 8.5 by 11 so I can really look at them. So we're going to work on the big flower masses. Now let's start right up here, because this is a real messy flower. It's kind of half dying. It's probably got a bit wet. So we can really be very loose with this. And I'm going to use the rose mixed with the raw sienna for this one, because it's not as vibrant as this one down here. And it'll give us a good start somewhere where it doesn't really matter. Plus it's up on the, if you're right-handed, it's up on the upper left. So we can work on that easily. I'll bring that down so you can see. So let's start there. We're going to work one flower at a time. I'm going to have a couple of brushes in my hands. I've got my number 8 brush at the moment for wetting those flowers. And then I have my number 4 brush for putting some colour on them. And then I'm just going to make sure everybody's muted so we don't have any background noises. Make sure you're all got your microphones muted, or we have noises in the background. There we go. Right. So let's go to the upper left corner, bigger brush to wet, and you probably have a little bit of drawing. So these up here are the flowers. So we're going to put those in. It doesn't matter if some of the pink goes over the green leaves. The dark green that we put over the top will obliterate that, so don't worry. We're going to practice on this one up here. It's not very important one, not one that people are going to see. And I've got my mix of rose plus raw sienna on my smaller brush. I'm just going to tap that up here on those flowers that I've wet. Have a little bit of raw sienna by itself. And a little bit of, it's got a little bit of pink on my brush still. I'm going to make this one more kind of raw sienna-ish. And don't worry about them too much. They're pinkish kind of blobs behind the leaves, and we're going to make the leaves structured so it will be easy to read that those are plants. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to let it kind of bleed. If I want to put a little bit more color on when it's dry, I certainly have that option. And don't stress about it. Just, let it do its own thing, whatever it wants to do. And I'm coming down the painting, and this one is pretty significant against the green. So that one we're going to do with either your Quinacridone Magenta if you have it, or your Quinacridone Rose if you don't have that. They'll both look beautiful, so don't worry. Wet first with your big clean brush. And again, these are abstract, so don't get too precious about them or too worried. The less you worry, probably the better they will turn out. Now this time I'm going to go in with my small brush into the magenta. And think about a little bit about putting that in where it can flood. See how the magenta just floods? It's a different kind of a pigment. If you have white space, just leave it. That's lovely. The white space is really nice. I'm going to tease. I've got a very dry brush. Tease a little bit of it out to the edge gently. Leave some white space. And this one up here is already starting to dry. They do dry a little bit lighter. We'd take them one at a time. The ones in behind here are more the raw sienna and pink colour. There's a few in behind the leaves there. It doesn't matter if you don't get them in exactly the right place. You're going to have some pink behind the green leaves, and that's going to look lovely. I'm going in to my raw sienna and rose mix. I do have this one mixed on my palette so that I can dip into it. I've got my little tiny brush. And these ones kind of go behind these big leaves. A little bit of pink here. I didn't even wet this little bit down here. Just a little bit showing through. A little floret here. Now the thing is, if we get to a point when we start putting the green leaves in that you feel you've got too much white space, you can just blob a few little pink flowers in there. It's going to look completely natural. To start with, I'm just following the photograph. But later, if I want to put some in to fill space, that's fine. I've got this one done. I've got this one done. Got these ones here. And now I'm going to work on this one over here. And probably make it a little bit brighter so that it really stands out against the barn. I'm going to use my magenta for that. That one's over here. I love how the magenta just floods when you touch it to the water. Move that so you can see what I'm doing. I'm slowly working my way down. So there are some in here behind the leaves. I have my trying to see where I've put the water now. Okay, tip my paper, see if I can see where I put the water. There we go. I'm also going to get some of that raw sienna and pink as well. That was the magenta that I put on. Going to get a little bit of the raw sienna and the rose over here. And this big mess over here, we can work with both colours, with the magenta and with the raw sienna and the rose. We have quite a big mass of flowers over here. Some hiding behind the green leaves. I try to draw these flower shapes out for you, but once you get the drawing amongst the leaves, everything just gets lost. I couldn't keep it in the shape so that they were distinguishable. I just hope you can use your photo reference to kind of guide you. And I'm kind of dotting my magenta where the centers of those florets would be. I'm getting some of my raw sienna mix, adding a little bit of that. I know it's a little bit formless. You can add so much of the structure with the leaves, form and structure, to bring it all together. If you're a gardener, it really helps because you know what rhododendrons look like, so that can help you as you put the florets in. Some over here, there's a little bud there. I think I've added a little bit more than there is in the picture over here. Okay, but I've put a bit of extra flower over here, probably just because I felt I needed a little bit of something extra. And then, of course, right over here, right here, sort of in front of the water wheel, is the big, big mass of flowers. Now, there's a few that have a little bit more, few buds that have a bit more shape, so I'm doing those mostly kind of where it's dry. that bud there. And just here. Now we're later going to connect all of those with stems, with leaves. Just getting a little bit more strong magenta and putting some depth into the center of these, the edge. I'm going to grab a little bit of raw sienna on my brush, just plain raw sienna. Add a little bit of that here and there. And for now that, I just pull back a little bit. For now that's enough. I can add a little bit in behind all the greenery later if I feel like I need a bit more. We don't want to overdo it because I've got other things to do, but that gets a good amount of beautiful pinky and magenta color in the foreground. Of course, what we're working with here are the complements of the pink and the green, which are beautiful complements, and the lovely neutral of the Waterwheel. So I will let you catch up with all of your wet in wet flowers. And the next thing we'll work on is the Waterwheel. So it doesn't matter that the flowers are wet because this is all dry over here for the buildings. And like I said, you can either use Payne's Grey, and I'll put that down with some water, very, very light. There's my Payne's Grey with some water. Let's get my test paper. Could add just a little bit more pigment. You have to be very careful not to use too much because you want your building to be a nice light grey. That looks pretty good. So look at that. It's just basically kind of stained water. Now, if you don't have Payne's Grey, that doesn't matter because grey is very easy to mix. It's what you mix when you mix three primary colors together. So I want soft primaries. So cobalt blue is a very soft, liftable primary. So cobalt blue. Raw sienna is your primary yellow, but in a soft, liftable color. So I got a little bit of raw sienna. And your primary red is your Quinacridone Rose, soft, cool color, a little bit of that, a little bit more raw sienna, a bit more cobalt to get it down to a soft gray, a little bit more cobalt, and then a bit more water. So if you don't have Payne's Grey, then mix this beautiful gray using cobalt blue, raw sienna, and just a teeny touch of rose. If the rose makes it too pink, then go back and put in your blue and your raw sienna, mostly blue. Now let's test that against this one. Now you can barely see a difference, right? That one that I just mixed is just slightly warmer than the Payne's Grey, which doesn't matter. And if you want it less warm, just add a little bit more blue. So if I want that a little slightly less warm, I'm going to put a little bit more cobalt blue in. Always a little bit more water because we want it very light. I'm going to test it again. Perfect. It's a cooler grey. It's almost exactly the same as the Payne's Grey. And I'm also going to need a little bit of raw sienna for that wood stain under the eaves of the building. So I'm going to get a little bit of raw sienna. Not too thick. And there I have my really, really light colours ready for the buildings. And because they're quite small, I think, a number 2 or a number 4 brush. To start with a number 4 and check out my reference photo. So I'm going to start by taking the raw sienna down from the top. Just like that. I'm just taking it down from the top. Wash my brush and get some of the nice light grey on my brush. And just let it meet that raw sienna. Painting around the leaves and the flowers. And at the bottom of the shed there's some green bushes, so I'm just coming down to them. And I kind of like to do the wet in wet first. So same thing on the side of this, little bit of raw sienna here. And then put the very, very light grey. We're going to come along with darker grey later and fill in some of the darker shapes. But right now this is your first light layer. There'll be dark behind the water wheel. Can't put that on yet. We're just doing all the light grey. And this underneath here is all green shrubs and green bushes. So I'm going to pull that down into the shrubs a little bit. If your grey is looking a bit too dark, definitely lighten it up for the roof. And I'm switching to a number 6 brush because there's a bit more roof than sides to do. So I want to make sure I get the paint on fairly fast across the roof and really light. Really, really light. And I'm not going to do the side of the roof yet because it'll all bleed down into the raw sienna, so I'll leave that till last. Let's get my small brush again. And there's some raw sienna on the edges here. Let's put that on. Here's my, I've got my number 4 brush, that'll do. And there's a window here. I don't have any of the detail in the window yet. I'll put that in when this is dry. All right, I'm really concentrating on getting the raw sienna and the grey mixing wet and wet. Now, same thing here. I'm putting on a little bit of raw sienna. I'm going right across. There's a lot of detail that we can sharpen up when this layer is dry. And some trees coming back over the roof here. And we have quite, again, oops, I've got raw sienna in my grey now. That's lovely, isn't it? I need a bit more grey that doesn't have raw sienna in it. There we go. I want to get the roof going across here. And all of this area behind here. And if you did the wagon wheel last time, the water wheel is very similar to the wagon wheel, similar structure. But we're going to have the top, I'm going to put the raw sienna at the top here. And then it's quite darker at the bottom, but we won't worry about the dark yet because we've got some light edges to put in. And we'll bring that around. And the struts. And we'll fill in all of the dark when this is dried. So don't worry about the dark behind this. Let's just get this in first. And we don't need too much detail. There's a lot of detail in the photo. We don't need all of that. Just need the basics in there. I'm just dragging a little bit of that paint off with my thirsty brush. Now I've just got the end of the roof to do here. And here, oops, see, that's what happens. I've got it in my raw sienna. Be more careful, Caroline. There, edge of the roof. So we got the base grey on. And another place we're going to put a little bit is, there's a little stone wall here. I'll let you catch up. There's a stone wall. And you can choose to do this or not, but there is a tunnel where the river goes into the mill pond through a tunnel here, and if you want to do that with some grey stone, you can. I will put it in. It's just under here. Kind of helps. The only reason I put it in really is it helps to have something behind rather than just a white empty space behind all your rhododendron leaves. It really helps to have something in there. So I'll just pop some medium grey in for now, and then we'll have a darker tunnel. Over the top of it, over the top of that tunnel is some grass going over the top. So we'll leave that for green. It's almost, you almost don't notice it in the photo. So it's not a big deal. Got that in over there. And then we have this little stone wall just over here. And it's more raw sienna, that stone wall. It's more in the sunlight. Again, you don't need much detail. You can put the raw sienna on. When the raw sienna is dry, you can do a little bit of grey shadow, a few cracks in the wall. You don't have to fuss with it. I just put a little bit of raw sienna on there. Maybe I just touched a little grey to it, just a tiny bit. And I'll leave that. That can all get worked on later. There's a lot of ways to mix a sap green actually. If you have quinacridone gold, that is the best way. So if you have, it's like a magic trick. If you have phthalo green and quinacridone gold, if you're lucky enough to have those two, and you mix them together, you get the most gorgeous transparent sap green. Look at that, just those two colors. It's like magic. Put it on the paper here. It's a beautiful color. Beautiful, beautiful color. Of course, I can add a bit more gold if I wanted a bit more yellow, a bit more water. And we have this lovely color. So those two colors together make a lovely, lovely sap green. If you don't have those two colors, don't worry. I'm using my Azo Yellow. Show you a few green mixes. I've got my Phthalo green, and that makes a very, very bright green. And then if I get some Ultramarine Blue, I'm going to just take that down a notch little bit of ultramarine blue, and you get a very beautiful green that's almost, this in fact is like the sap green that a lot of manufacturers make. The more expensive manufacturers use the quinacridone gold and sap green mix because it's more transparent, but this is still beautiful. That's your phthalo green and your yellow mixed with a little bit of ultramarine blue, and you can see that's a very lovely green too. All beautiful. And we've got a good variety. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to this one because the phthalo green is so strong that it will quickly turn any yellow into green. I'm going to add a ton more yellow to that. I got a really, really bright green. And then here I'm going to mix a really dark green for the forest with the phthalo green and the Quinacridone Magenta. Or you can use that other one that I bought, I've forgotten what it's called now. Anyway, that makes a beautiful, beautiful, just those two colours, the phthalo green and the Quinacridone Magenta. Maroon, it was the maroon that I bought, also makes a beautiful dark green. And if you didn't want that dark green quite that dark or quite that green, you can add a bit of yellow to that, bit of ultramarine. Loads of ways to make beautiful, beautiful greens. Put them all there. I'm probably going to use all of them at some time while we're painting this. I'm just going to mix up. I'm going to mix up one that's just ultramarine blue and Azo Yellow because that's a very good green too, and one that you can wash back because they don't stain. And in addition to all of those, to do those bright green leaves, I need clean water. I have hideously dirty water now. Let's grab some clean water. I also just want some yellow to start off those leaves. So my Azo Yellow is a little bit dirty now. That wasn't the word I was using, but it's not quite warm enough. So I'm going to add just a touch of my gamboge just to make a slightly warmer yellow. A little touch. It doesn't matter that I've got a lot of blue in my yellow now. It's gone a bit mucky. Let's clean it up a little bit. Then I want to have that warmer yellow ready to do some of those really bright green leaves, because when they dry they look too dark. Very quickly look too dark. So, and I will use, let me think about brush size. I think my number 4 or my number 2 will be good for the leaves. So we're gonna start with the very, 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 very light leaves. These ones, these ones, these ones, these ones, a few here and here, the ones, a couple here that are really bright. And let's start with the ones up in the top left corner. I'll zoom in a little bit. Now we're not doing all the leaves this light green, just some of them. And I want to start with just the yellow for these. I'm just going to use the shape of my brush to make the leaf shape. I'm going to put the yellow on first. That's just the yellow. And then I'm going to take the very, very bright, the brightest green I made. This is the yellow with the phthalo green, really, really bright. And while those are wet, I'm just going to touch the yellow with the phthalo green mix. Because I know that my other ones, these ones, they dried so pale and washed out, even though they looked really strong when I put them on. So I decided to try a different method. Now there's a few here sticking up that are light at the tips. This is where this method works well. They're light at the tips, but down at the base they're more green. So I'm putting the yellow on first and then the green at the base of those, so that it kind of floods up into the yellow. I can always push it back a bit if it's flooding up too much. Around this one here is very yellow. And then there's a whole bunch here, starting just with that yellow. And those, I'm doing that with my number 2 brush and grabbing the green and actually I'm going to do the stalk, stem, whatever you like to call it, coming down, and just let that flood into that yellow at the base. Some of these leaves, when they're on their side, you just see this kind of slender view of them, like a sliver of them. If your green floods up too much, use your thirsty brush, clean and dry it off, and just push it back a little bit. Just control it if it's flooded up too much. And it will look at the moment very yellow, but I promise you it will fade quite a bit. And then you're going to get all your other colors in there too. That's a really yellow one here. Also, when they're dry, if they still look too yellow to you, you can put a green glaze over the top. You don't have to stick with what you've got if it doesn't look right. Again, I've put the yellow on, then I've got my bright green. Popping that on. This is just an experiment. I didn't do this last time. I didn't write this in my notes. I'm just feeling that my yellow leaves in my other ones they didn't stand out. That bright color. Oh. And sometimes you can switch to your bright green if they're not quite that yellow. I'm just switching over for some of these to one that's a bit brighter green. These are all dark green, so we won't do those at the moment. And these ones coming out, they are a dark green too. Now remember, we're going to have a lot of dark brown behind these. We need them to really show up. These ones I'm just doing now are especially bright in the photograph. Luckily I've got a few greens mixed up here, so I'm just going to pop that one in here. As when I come to do the, or we all come to do the brown over here, I want to have the ones that are sticking out, I want to be able to find them easily. I don't want to have to paint over them by accident or and there's a few more light ones here. There's quite a lot of sort of river grass there. I don't think we need to worry about all of that. That's just too much detail to worry about. And there's just this big one that sticks out to the river. I'm just going to use one of my medium greens to do that one. Maybe the one with the ultramarine blue, because it'll be easy to take the pull the highlights off of that one. But I'm going to put it in full strength, and then when it's dry, I'll pull some highlights off of there. A little bit of shadow on it. I'm just touching, it's still wet. I'm just touching a little bit of the dark paint to the edge of that one, just to get some shadow. You don't have to do all those dark ones now. If you haven't got your paint ready, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. I just put them in because I know I'm going to be doing, I've got a big blob of phthalo green there, which is not a good look. I'll get that off. And water some Kleenex. Yeah, I put those on to help me when I do the water, so that I kind of can paint around them a little bit. It's very tricky having all of these leaves in front of where the water's going to be, so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to paint around them, and we don't want to do too many of them. But I especially wanted those in the foreground, so I can, and here we'll just put the dark leaves over the top of the water, and all of these can go in afterwards. We don't have to worry too much. So let's pull back a little bit. Mainly let's get the yellowy green ones in, so that they're in there. I think I've got them all, and I might have missed a couple. I might have missed a couple here. There we go. I'm looking at my reference photo, and I think there's a few here. That's good enough for now. And we have a few other greens too. So do you want me to go over some of the mixes again? I did write most of them down. We have on page 2, we have a list of mixes. For instance, I've put like have Azo Yellow out, or cadmium yellow, then Azo Yellow plus Phthalo Green, or you can mix it with Phthalo Blue or Prussian Blue if you don't have Phthalo Green, and then the Azo Yellow with Phthalo Green and Ultramarine Blue to darken it up, and then the Phthalo Green and the Quinacridone Magenta, or you can add some yellow to that, or blue. We just want to have a good variety. So if you haven't got your variety of greens yet, have them ready, so that you can put in all of these other things, the grass, all of these shrubs, the trees, this very, very light grass over here. It's nice to have this nice and light as a contrast with everything else that's dark. And it's only a little tiny bit of grass just across the top here. That's basically kind of your yellowy green, but watered down a little bit to make it much, much lighter. And also, if you want to make it a little less, it's a very, what I call acidic green, almost like a lime green. If you don't want it quite so acidic, you're going to add a little bit of raw sienna to it to make it a little gentler. If you don't want it quite so in your face. And I'm going to get my really small number 2 brush to put that bit of grass in that goes along here in the background. And I'm using the mix that I just made that had a little bit of raw sienna and a little bit more water added to it. And I'm putting that in behind, let's zoom in. I'm putting it in behind what will be the dark leaves coming over the top, and sort of behind here, and it goes over the top of the bridge here too. So, and it's behind these leaves as well. So it's all behind here. And the other place that there is some grass is over here, quite light grass, coming down to this wall here, just sloping down. So again, that's that really light mix with a tiny bit of raw sienna added in it, so it's not quite so in your face. And it's kind of a little bit greener on the top. So I have this one, which is the yellow and the phthalo green with a little bit of ultramarine to make it a little bit less bright. And I'm just adding a little bit of that to the edge to make the edge of that grass just a little bit greener, bluer green. Just dabbing that in. So going for it, zoom in on the picture. If you can see, it's kind of like very light near the wall, and then it goes back here a little bit. It's got a little bit darker green on it, so it's just got that kind of double color. I'm going to use the same green. There's some foliage here. I'm going to put that on just here. And do the same thing. I'm going to take one of the darker greens, and while that's wet, it's like doing the flowers. I'm getting some darker, not as wet green, and just letting it flood into that light wet green while it's still wet. So we're building up slowly. The grass is first, and then the next thing we'll build up is the foliage that's all around the water wheel. Doing a very similar thing because the tops of this foliage here is quite bright, and then if we use some dark green while that's wet, you can get a little bit of shadow around this here. Underneath here is lots of dead roots coming down, so we can use some of the grey and later some of the brown to put those kind of dead roots hanging down in there. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the yellowy green for the light part of this, and I've got my brush and I'm kind of got it on its side sort of, and I'm just wiggling it around. I'm not so much painting as wiggling. And this is the light green. And with my smaller brush, I'm going to take a darker green mix, probably one with a bit of ultramarine blue in, and on the underneath where there's less light, and I've got less water in this mix. If you have too much water, it will flood everywhere. You'll get too much flooding. You have to have less water. And then I'm just putting in a bit of that shadow. And over here by the water wheel, there's something growing up. I'm going to a bluer mix, one that's got more ultramarine blue in. Have some sort of creeping plant climbing up here. And it's quite dark under here. And then, like I said, there's all of those roots coming out underneath of here. So we're not going to put the dark in at the moment, but I'm going to grab the grey that I used for the water wheel in the building, and I'm going to put that grey in, and I'll put some dark brown later when the grey is dry and have those roots coming down. I know the wall is dry, so I'm also putting in some grey shadow on that wall as well, behind this bush, coming along here. A few bits of grey. And then I'm going to do the same over here. Now, all of these foreground shrubbery things are quite bright, so I'm going to use my mix that has quite a bit of phthalo green in it, but some ultramarine blue as well, and obviously some yellow as well, so that we can get that really nice bright look to it. And sap green is a great one too. And don't be too worried about the shape of it. We've got stuff climbing up the, we've got some, looks like ivy over here. We're going to do that a little bit darker. There's white flowers on this bush. I put those in when I was all finished with the P.H. Martin's white. Or you can use a white gouache or a white pencil. So I'm starting with the yellowy green mix. And then I'm going to switch to the sap green. Smaller brush. I also have a sap green paint. So I can use that, or my mix. And again, at the bottom of this, where it's darker, I'm going to put in some darker paint. Then I want to get the one that has the blue in it. And the ivy is a much bluer green. So over here where the ivy is creeping up the building, I'm going to put it in a much darker bluer green. And there's some other plant behind here. And in front of that, there's some grass growing up. So I'm going to flick my brush upwards. I'm using the mix that has phthalo green and yellow and ultramarine for a sort of a more grassy color. Grab some of the yellowy green for the side here. Now we're going to reflect some of this in the water when we do it, so don't worry too much. Now I want to go back to my ultramarine darkish mix and put some shadow behind here. It's quite dark in here. And we'll get some white flowers on if you want to when we're finished. And a bit more of the slightly brighter green mix over here. And there's some back here somewhere. Oh, we don't want to fiddle too much, she says, after fiddling for ages. But we just want to kind of get the light and the dark. I'm going back to this one now, it's a bit more dry. And just putting in a little bit more dark underneath here. So that's kind of dealt with all the foreground greens. Our next big challenge is to get all of these background greens in. And I think for me that's the most challenging part. There's like the yellow edges to the trees here, then the dark and the sort of the dark and the light, and it's all quite challenging to do wet in wet. So we want to make sure before we start that again we've got plenty of paint mixed up, nice wet paint, so that you can do that wet in wet and you don't have to worry about it drying up and so forth. So I'm going back to all of my greens here, and I want to mix more up and I want them to be nice and wet. So while you're catching up to me, I'm going to get a whole mix of paints here again, starting with lots of yellow for the edges of the trees, and just to that really bright mix. I'm not going to add any more green, I'm just going to add some yellow to that really bright one there. And then the next one will be the yellow with the phthalo green and a little bit of ultramarine blue. A bit more yellow, ultramarine blue, a bit of phthalo, a bit more blue. Now we've got a kind of mid-green. Now I have Sap Green. I'm just going to pop that in there. It's a lovely convenience green to have, Sap Green, if you have a good brand. The cheap brands are not nice at all. Or some of the, although I'm a big Winsor & Newton fan, I do not like Winsor & Newton Sap Green. I don't like what they use to mix it. I only like Daniel Smith and Quor greens. They're the only ones that seem to be this lovely transparent sap green. So over here we're going to mix just yellow, ultramarine blue. Got a nice deep bluey green. I got really good bluey green there. And then in the very dark green, I want to use the phthalo green and the magenta. And we're going to use these for the rhododendron leaves as well as the background, so you know they're going to be useful. I'm just testing it on my paper. Yeah, that's lovely. It looks nicer on the paper than on the palette. The magenta, being the complementary green, is always going to darken it up nicely and fairly transparently. So I've got a really good range of greens there. I'm going to use my number 10 brush for the background because I want to get it in as wet and as quickly as possible. I'll probably switch to a smaller brush when I go around these rhododendron flowers because I want to get around them without coming over the edge of them too much. When I started before, I started over here with the yellow and then the green because I always like to start with yellow first. That worries me because I'm going to have wet paint over here when I want to go over here and do the detail, so I'm kind of thinking I might do it in the reverse order this time and see if that's easier. The thing that's going to be hard is getting around these leaves and flowers and the roof with nice edges, but keeping everything wet in the background and dark enough. It's quite a big challenge. So here we go. Big brush, number 10 brush, but I will switch for the smaller details. I have them all ready. Going to go in just here with my lightest color. It's okay, I'm going to come up to it with dark color in a moment. Just want to put a bit of light color in there and zoom in so you can see my mistakes as I make them. And then I'm going to grab my green that I made with the ultramarine blue, really dark green, and some sap green. I'm going to get both on my brush at the same time. I dipped my brush in the ultramarine blue green and then I dipped it back in the sap green at the same time. What I don't want to do is for any of my paint to dry out to make ugly lines while I'm painting. I especially want to have that lovely green leaf. I'm going to grab some of the even darker paint and concentrate. Now look, Caroline, don't let this bit dry when you're fiddling about with that bit. You really have to talk to yourself sternly, otherwise you can get very carried away. Okay, dipping into the sap green. Now this is why you need really wet paint. I'm going to a smaller brush for a moment, into the very dark green, the one that's phthalo green and magenta, as I want to go around these flowers carefully, have them really stand out against the dark, and I like dark corners, eye stoppers I call them, and get in there. Right, I'm really going for it this time. I didn't go dark enough last time, so I'm pushing the boundaries. You don't have to be so so reckless. Don't worry. Coming down to this grass here. Okay, bigger brush again. No, smaller brush, Caroline. Don't get carried away. It's a real marathon because I want to get this in while the paint's still wet. And get around the edges of these flowers too. The nice thing is I have a lovely straight line here where the grass meets the trees. So I'm going into the yellow again as I come over here. I want to have some light. And of course my brush is dirty, it doesn't matter. I'm getting a mix of colours. And go into my dark paint again. And carefully come up against the edge of the roof. So I got a nice straight line there. Right. I keep checking back to make sure. I'm going to grab a clean brush because I want a little bit of light paint here. And just keep checking back to make sure that these edges over here, oops, no, my finger's in the paint now, are not drying up so that I can work wet and wet into them without any danger of having dry lines. I got 3 brushes in my hand. And I'm changing greens quite frequently. I'm actually really glad I started on the left this time because I know I need to hold my hand close to the paper to get around these trees. Not trees on the brain. These roofs, sorry. Get around these roofs and rest my hand. I'm not trying for any tree shapes. That would be lunacy at this point. I'm just trying for the combination of greens and getting the paint on. I want, as I come over to the right here, I want to get lighter because the trees are getting lighter over here. So I want to put, I grab some yellow on my number 8 brush. And I want to come over to get that more yellow look over here. And that's why I've got 3 brushes, because my other 2 got too green. So I'm putting that light yellow in over here, so you can see. And I also want to grab some of the darker green and put that in as well, so that it blends into the yellow wet and wet. This is why you need a lot of green ready. Going down into the slightly greener green. What does that mean, Caroline? Greener green? Just, you know, like regular green, not dark green. Because sort of these are in sunshine over here. I'm grabbing a bit of yellow to mix with that sort of medium green over here. And going back to the darker green and adding a little bit in between these yellow yellow that's wet. It's quite dark next to the roof, and that's a good thing because your roof is quite light, so you want to have that contrast of the dark and light near the roof. And I have, the only time I'm making any attempt to sort of have some tree shape is over here on the right, where it's coming down into the landscape over here. So I'm just, as I come down over here, I've got my number 6 brush in my hand, and I'm sort of making a bit more shape just here where it comes down. I'm going to grab some yellow. I'm just going to shove some yellow in there. Now you notice this little bit of yellow here dried quite quickly, and I didn't get a nice soft edge. Doesn't matter, I'm going to soften that when it's dry with a little bit of water. That'll be fine. And one of the things I did in my first one, and possibly even my second one, was I tried scratching some of those tree trunks out of the paint back here. I don't think I'm going to fuss with that on this one. I just think that's too much fussing. If you want to try that, you can, but I suggest you just leave the background some wet in wet. And don't fuss too much if it doesn't look great right now, because wet in wet tends to look much, much better when it's had a chance to dry and you've got everything else put in around it. You know, I've got things like I've got the rhododendron leaves to put in here, and I've got the inside of the bridge. I'm just going to grab some Payne's grey. Show you what I mean, like under the bridge here. Smaller brush, number 2 brush, and grab some Payne's grey, and this is where the water goes under the bridge into, I guess, the river, because most mills are fed by a river. I'm just putting that on, and there's a little bit of like stonework. Very little, you don't have to put much detail. And I don't think anybody will probably even notice it, but it's there in the picture, so just popping that in there. And of course we're going to have a lot more dark in the mill. Our next job will be to put all the darks that are happening in the mill. But what I want to do is get all this green off of my brushes. We'll still need green for the last touches. We'll need green for the leaves of the rhododendron. We'll need some green for the reflections in the water, and that's about it really. So but I want to get the green off my brushes, because our next job is to get all of the dark detail in around the water wheel. This is a long one. This was our finale, our grand finale. You know me, I always have a challenging one for the last one. So it's definitely challenging. Right, now let's think about the mill. The first thing I want to do is I like to put this white on with the P.H. Martin's white, this water that's coming down, but there's a blue tinge behind it. So I'm going to put some Ultramarine Blue where that water's coming down. Now there's also some shadow. I don't have to worry about, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the whole thing in between these struts with the Ultramarine Blue, and then I'll put the shadow on and the white on after this is all dry. You don't want your ultramarine blue too dark, but you want that blue shadow for when you put the water on. If you've put it on with masking fluid, that's fine. You can paint your blue right over the top of your masking fluid. The reason we're doing this first is we're going to want to come back with some dark to fill in the shadow behind here. And of course, when you come up to your little green bush, that's you have to form the edge of the bush with the shadow color. So you come around it. Now in here and the other part of the wheel is going to be very, very dark. So we're going to use our dark mix for that, which is, like I said, my standard dark mix, which is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And part of the reason is you can always scrub this color out, wash it back. It's non-staining, it's lovely and dark. It's beautiful for any darks that you need to do. So you want pretty much equal amounts of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, not much water. We're not doing washes with this. We're putting in detail. You want a little bit of burnt sienna by itself. For some of those kind of woody details, you might want to put a little bit of burnt sienna on some of those where we put the raw sienna before. You might want to put a little bit more color. So I've got those two ready. Put my greens out of the way. And again, that's because I'm right-handed, I'm going to start over here on the left. I've got my number 4 and my number 2 brush because we're doing small detail. I think I'll use my number 2 brush for now. And that dark mix that I've just made, and the first place that I can see is quite a dark shadow down here. So I'm going to put that on. On the edge of the roof there. And along where the shingles sort of, or shakes or whatever they are on the roof, there's kind of some shadows between them coming down the roof there. You want me to come in a bit more even? There we go. So I've got a very small brush, my number 2 brush, and I'm going to put on a few of these planks, whatever you call them, whatever, the bits of wood that the shed's made from. Those lines between them. And put those in. I'm going to grab a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush, and I'm going to add a little bit more. Oops, that's not enough. Wash your brush and grab a bit of burnt sienna. And put a little bit of burnt sienna at the top here where it's a little darker. And add a little bit more colour. There's a sort of a opening, a window opening. It's going to go around that. It's got 4 hinges, couldn't remember what they were called, on there, and it's also got some construction lines. So slowly we're sort of building up a little bit of dimension in the sheds, so that again the top of the roof is a little bit darker. I'm just making that a little bit darker across there, and coming down here. I've got a wet brush, I'm just easing that colour in a little bit. Now, as you're coming across these lines for the shingles or the shakes, I never know what they are, probably shingles on a roof and shakes on the side of the building here. You're sort of coming along and then you're pushing your brush up every so often where you can see they're kind of lifting on the edge. So it's kind of doing the edge of the roof. So you're coming along a little bit, you're going up a little bit, up. They're worn and old, so you're not wanting straight lines going across there. You want to give a little sense of that old wood. And those the ones that are lifting at the edge as you come across. And I'm just using my the dark ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mix. Sometimes I'm diluting it a little bit with a wet brush so it's not quite as dark. Now we're at the edge of the roof here. And we got to the edge there. Now, underneath the edge of the roof is quite dark. So I'm using my number 4 brush for that. And I've wetted a little bit because I want to kind of control. First of all, I'm going to paint under the roof. I know it comes down vertically, but I want to get under there first with my paint. Wet my brush a little bit, and then I want to, before that dries too much, I want to pull that shadow down. It doesn't come down evenly. Now, if your paint's too dry, you're going to get a line, so you have to be careful that your paint's wet enough that you can pull these shadows down. Now I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush because some of them have like a browny tinge to them, and it's kind of a dry brush look. I'm adding a little bit of burnt sienna in places. Now I'm going to dilute out that colour that I made. Okay, over here I'm diluting it down here so it's not as strong. It's a lighter grey, and I'm going to come down some of those planks with a slightly lighter grey. And what you can see mostly in between these planks is just a sliver of light grey. Oh, that's the look I'm going for, is getting the dark in and leaving that sliver of light between them. That also happens on these ones a bit darker. Just there. Now behind the water wheel, it's very dark. So I've got the mix now not diluted. And I'm going to come down behind the wheel into the plants. And get that dark on. I know it's kind of scary getting those really dark areas on, but we really, really need them. Also behind these plants and behind the wheel, dark too, dark back here. We're gonna darken up the wheel as well, but first we'll get this on so that we've got the edge to the wheel, and then we'll come back and we'll darken up some of the other things. For instance, I need to mix up more dark. My dark's getting diluted, and I'm running out of the nice dark, so I've got to get a bit more ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I need a good amount of blue in that, because I want to go into some of the really dark spots. Number 4 brush, I think, is gonna do me. So between these wheels struts, it's really dark back here, so I want to get that in. We'll probably have to darken up the wheel struts a bit because they will look too light once you get the dark back here. But that's okay. And very dark back here too. And again, as you come down to the greenery, you have to make an edge to the greenery that's the shape of the bushes. And that there's also some dark around where we put the blue, but we'll get to that in a little while. I'm going to my number 2 brush now because I really want to get into the small detail now. Under these struts over here. And some of these show up really, really light, so we'll keep them light to start with. And then if we need to darken some of them, we can do that when this is all dry. I'm going to keep my eye on where the struts are and where I'm putting my darks. I always love getting the darks in. It kind of I don't know, it's kind of exciting. It pulls everything together and really makes all the lights stand out. Up until then, the lights look a little bit washed out and not light enough, but then you get all these darks in and everything looks great. And even that dark that I just mixed up, I'm getting through it quite quickly. I'm having to dip back into it quite a lot to keep a good amount of dark on my brush. And I'm looking at my pictures so I don't lose track of where all the struts are. Now, as they're quite dark at the bottom where I'm painting now, but as they come up this part of the building, they're much, much lighter. So I'm going to dilute the grey down so that the planks at the top here are lighter and not as dark. We don't have to go, we don't have to go into a massive amount of detail. As long as we get some lights and darks in there and a little bit of structure that works, we'll be fine. Under here is very dark too, so I need a slightly bigger brush to go under there. I think I'll use my number 8. And I don't have enough paint. I've got to mix up a little bit more so it's not too light, because this really is a dark spot back here. And get that nice dark in the background there. Coming up to the, even under the trees here, there's some dark. And up to the grass. Now I've tapped off my brush. It's got the dark on my number 8. I've tapped a little bit off so it's not quite as dark. I'm just putting a little bit of shadow under those branches where they come out. A little bit more dark there. And I know this blue bit looks weird at the moment, but it will be all right. It'll be okay. Now also by the wall here, I'm going to add a little bit more brown into that dark, so it's more brown. Same mixture, same ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, but I've added a bit more burnt sienna, so we've got more of a brown color here for underneath these weeds that are growing out here. Got some shadow under the wall and under these leaves. Not leaves, I think they're kind of like roots. Some kind of root coming down here. And it's quite where everything meets the water. It's quite dark too, so I'm adding a little bit of dark line. I'm adding the stones on the wall with a little bit of that dark brown. Just the divisions between the stones. A little bit of dark under here. And over here, it's quite dark just in here. A little bit of dark. Those little tiny bits of dark are really important to give everything a dimension. And I've got a wet brush and I'm just going to soften that shadow at the edge of the wall. And a little bit. And we're going to keep working on the shadow. There's at the end of this building, it's a little darker than the roof, so switching to my number 6 brush and my bluey grey that I mixed up, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And without getting my hand in that wet paint, I should have done this first. But I'm going to put a little bit more dark over here. I'll be very careful. I've got wet paint that I can easily smudge with my hand if I'm not careful. I'm going around the window because I want to put some dark window panes in a moment. And I want a little bit of burnt sienna on the edges. And there'll be some planking to put on there as well. when that's dry. Going back to my number 2 brush, because these planks down the side have got that like light division between them. So I want to bring them down, but with light between them. And this kind of the edge of the wheel structure coming out here. It's just that little bit there that's darker, and then the planks kind of come along here. There's some kind of a hanging structure comes out there, and then it's dark under here. Again, you don't have to get too fussy. You just get the lights and the darks in the right places, and things tend to work out. This area here where there's the top of the wheel, it's quite light. It's not much dark there. Again, the roof has those shingles on. Let me get the edge of that roof there, and it's quite dark under the trees here. And same with this side of the roof. So there's those kind of dark spaces along the edge there, and there's a dark shadow down here too. Try not to smudge. I got to move it, otherwise I'm going to smudge. Sorry, I got to move around. Let's move the camera, move the paper. I got to move around so I can get this edge of the roof in without smudging everything else. And same with the shingles on the roof. We're going to come across each one and then sort of poke up, across and up, get these edges on them. Now we're ploughing ahead because we've got a 2-hour lesson. At this point, this is quite often where I'll go away and leave it for a few hours so that it's perfectly dry, and I can look at it and work on it small pieces at a time once it gets to this stage, because there's so much to do and so much drying time to wait for. Like there's all these planks on here that really need a lot of drying time before you put them on. I'm going to bung them on now, but I'd probably wait, you know, till tomorrow or after dinner before I came and did a lot of that stuff. But we need to get them on, so. We're putting the shingles on the roof. And some of that. Now there's also up here, there's some little windows. And I'm going to just be really, there's, how many? I put too many on there, almost. There's 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I just kind of left those. I'm just kind of doing some little dots on those. Right, I think I can turn it up the right way again. And let's bring the camera back. And I think we're good to work on the inside of the wheel now. I think I got enough dark paint left. My little number 2 brush still, because there's water pouring down inside the wheel. So I'm going to do kind of wiggly lines where the water's pouring down. And then this part inside is in deep shadow. And the water's kind of curving as it pours down. And we will put the white on, and then it will look much more realistic. We've got to get some of the shapes between the water here. And hopefully, once we get the white on there, it will look more like water. It's coming from up here and flowing down. So the only thing I'm doing with these ones at the top is just kind of using my small brush and that dark grey to just kind of put those posts in that are up here, just lightly. And between them, I've got the very, very light grey on my brush. Just between them, there's some planks that go across like that. So I'm just not doing too much. These posts back here are more shaded, so I've got that light grey. I'm just putting that light grey, pushing those posts into the background. And the other thing we've got to do now, we've got to form the wheel. I've still got my number 2 brush, and I'm going to start at the top. And there's these steps on the wheel. I'm going to get the brown, I'm going to get the mixture that's more brown. Number 2 brush. I'm going to bring it across those steps on the wheel. And it gets darker as it goes down the wheel. Do you want me to zoom in a little bit? As I come down the wheel, I'm adding more blue to the colour. But the top of the little step coming across the wheel is very light until you get almost halfway down. You can see that sliver of light across the top of the step. I'm going to exaggerate it and have a bit more than you can actually see. Because sometimes you would see it with the naked eye, but photography tends to obliterate a lot of stuff like that. Now as I get further down, I will just do what the camera has done, and that is smush it all in together. so that you don't see it as much, the delineation. It looks awful. Now I've zoomed in for you. It doesn't, you're seeing way too much that you don't see with the naked eye. Too much detail. I'm just going back in and putting a little bit more on the edge. These struts are darker, so I'm adding a bit of dark to the edges of these. And these are a bit darker too. I've got dry brush, very dry brush right now. Adding a little bit more. And as it goes across the top here, it gets lighter, then it gets darker here, darker here. And that strut's light. I went over that strut, that's very light. Oh, I'm going to pull back again because you're seeing it way too detailed. And you don't see a lot of that. I'm putting a little bit more dark as it goes under here. Shadow. Now I'm going to pull back a little bit more so you can see it's not quite as bitty as it looks when you're close up. And we're running out of time. We haven't half finished, have we? It's sorry about that. It's a long painting, and I think we'll leave the water wheel for a minute. If you want to put more detail on it later, then you can definitely catch up with all the little details later on. You know, putting in a bit more shadow and so forth. I'm just putting a bit more shadow there. But let's get the water in so that we can get that browny colored water mixing wet in wet with the greens of the reflections and that kind of thing. Now I will tell you what we can't do today. I'll get my dry one. What we can't do until a day later is get these reflections in the water. Now this is how I did this. When this was completely dry a day later, I used my little brush and I pulled my brush down into the water to get the reflections of this structure, and then pulled with my Kleenex, and I got these reflections in the water the day after it was all dry. And that's one of the reasons for using the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. So there's quite a lot of light reflection. If you look on the photograph, there's all these light reflections coming down from the barn and the structure around the watermill rather. But it's much easier to do the day after this is all dry. So that's how I did those, and we won't be able to do them on the damp paint today. But that makes beautiful reflections. They come straight down, and of course I did that little bit of the reflection of the crossbar there as well. And all of this was done with the P.H. Martin's white and the little white flowers. So I don't think we're going to have time to get those on today, but let's get the water on. We're going to do some wet in wet. And what I want to get is, I want to make sure that my light green is wetted up. I've got to wet that up again for my reflections. And my mid green maybe. And then I want some burnt sienna by itself for some of the muddy sort of mill pond. And I want some burnt sienna with the ultramarine blue for some of the darker brown in the mill pond. And we're going to work this wet in wet just like we did the trees. So I've got nice dark brown, light green, and then some kind of fast working, and starting always with the light colors. So I'm going to start with the very light green that's reflected from the grass and the bushes over here. I'm going to put those in. Make sure it's nice and wet. I'm going to get some more green for the reflections over here. And they're very, very light, the reflections over here. So I'm using the light green. And as you come towards the foreground, there's a lot of green here too. So you want, if you're painting that, you need your number 8, your number 10 brush. Good horizontal brush strokes, because water's always horizontal. You get those in. You can get some of that light green here behind the rhodos, because you're going to put the dark green leaves in anyway, so you can put some light green behind there if you want. Then before that's dry, you need to get your brown, and the brown comes out from the water wheel, and you need to get it up against that light green before it dries, and then you can come in and go around the leaves. I also want a bit of that darker brown here and here, going in with the dark here. And then the medium brown, I'm going to take it horizontally side to side into that green. And then I've got to get a smaller brush to carefully go around some of those leaves. But I want to get that main sort of wet in wet look to start with. Keep your brush strokes, if you're doing water, always nice and horizontal. Now mine's starting to creep back a little bit into this, so I'm going to pull that down with a damp brush, get a little bit more green in there. And I need a smaller brush so I can get around the rhodo leaves. I'm going to have to work really fast because it will dry really quickly, and then I'm just going to get streaks. So that's why I want the paint to be nice and wet. It gives me some time to work. And this mill pond is quite dark, and like I just showed you, you can lighten it up later with a wet brush and a Kleenex. I won't be talking too much for the next second or so. I've really got to concentrate, get around these leaves. Because remember, I really want these light leaves to stand out against the dark mill pond. I'm dipping, like the key is to dip into paint all of the time. Make sure your brush is always really well loaded with paint. That way you won't run out of paint and it won't dry up too fast, and you get nice rich color. Just remember, it all lightens up as it dries. Now I want to go back to some light green as I'm coming in here, mixing with the wet and wet with the brown that I have. I'm getting a bit more brown, thick brown on my brush, not wet. And I'm putting in a bit more depth of colour, especially where it comes out here and here, adding a bit more dark brown. I know it looks scarily dark, but it needs to be to have the contrast. And then as we come back here, it's not as dark back here. I'm adding a little bit more green and brown back here. We'll get a greeny brown. I'm mixing a greeny brown under here, under all these leaves, behind the rhododendrons. Good thing I got loads of my green left here. I can just dip into anything. I'm adding a little bit of brown back there. See what I've got here. Bit of a greeny brown between these, because behind all of these rhododendron leaves you can see a little bit of the pond. So I'm just putting that in, and then you can fill in the rest with rhododendron leaves, and then you can come back and fill in little bits of pond or little bits of flower. It'll all be fine. Just grabbing a little bit more green. Oh, I want a little bit more yellow. A bit more yellow here just to push that. A bit more yellow here just to push that reflection of the green a bit stronger. And let that yellow flow into the brown that I have. The green and the brown is quite dark over here, so I'm going to push that a little darker over here too. And then of course it's really going to open up when we put the reflections in, when this is all dry and you can bring the reflections down. It will make it look much more like water. I'm going to put a little bit of that brown between those grasses over here. And a little bit here. Now the only thing left to really do is to get all of the dark green rhododendron leaves in. And also, remember when I did this one over here, I said I'm going to do it dark and scrub back the light later. Well, that's the easiest way to get the highlights on the leaves. Put them in dark, and then when they're dry, use your scrubby brush and scrub out the highlights on the leaf. You'll get a lovely soft highlight on those kind of shiny rhododendron leaves that looks more natural. It's very difficult to do that any other way, so I've just scrubbed out that highlight. There'll be another over here. There's a big leaf that will need a highlight on. I'm looking for the right size brush. So I think the best color for these rhododendron leaves is one that has a lot of ultramarine blue in, because they're very bluey green, and that is very easy to wash back. So I'm putting that leaf in the hopes that we have enough time to do that one before we have to leave. I'm going to do the whole video. Even if you have to leave, I'll do the whole video. So we get right to the end. Now that one's dark, but I will wash out some of the green later. So let's look at the main green for the dark leaves. Good mix. So a good mix is the Azo Yellow or Cadmium Yellow and the Ultramarine Blue. Makes a really good colour for these leaves, and maybe just a little touch of Phthalo, just a little touch. And I'm going to put some, I have some more Sap Green here, I'll put some of that here, and I'm going to add a little Ultramarine Blue to that. They're very blue, the rhododendron leaves. I've got a couple of nice juicy greens there. And here's my number 4 brush. So we're going to put in some of the dark leaves. I'm going with the Sap Green and Ultramarine Blue mix for a good dark leaf up here. Oh, it's all wet. I can't put my hand down. That's another reason I kind of go away and leave it for a few hours. Is I put my hand down a lot of this. It's way too wet. I smudge something. I'll put these leaves in over here. And some of them want to be a little bit lighter, so I'm going to do the Sap Green with the yellow and have some a bit lighter. Not a lot lighter, but a little bit. This one, for instance, I've done some Sap Green and some yellow for one that's not quite as blue. And if you want them really dark, then you do your Phthalo green with the Quinacridone Magenta. There's some leaves coming down back here and in the background. They are really, really dark. So that's my Sap Green and Magenta making those. Another thing is if you add a little bit more magenta to that, it makes the really dark, I'm just going to pop that in to show you, makes the really dark of the stems that are all over the place here. And they kind of connect everything. If you get some like stems going in here and there, then you get more connections with your plants. Let's go back to the green leaves. And there's actually a stem coming in there too. Now there's a few more to do there, but they're all kind of wet, so I don't want to do too many of them at once. I want to do some of the other ones while those ones are drying up. Do some of these over here. Sometimes I'm dipping in the one that's a little bit more yellow, sometimes the one that's a little bit more blue. I'm basically using one brush stroke with my number 4 brush. This one, of course, is not, because I put the stem in to show you the stem color, but really I should have got the leaves in first. And you're going to have to work your way around in that manner. So if some of them are wet, you're going to have to move to other ones. Some of them might be more yellow, more in the sunlight. Some might be much darker in the shade. So they might be your darker green. Grab a bit more yellow. But most of them are fairly dark. And you're going to put the leaves on first, and then of course there's quite a few like stems going over the top of the leaves, so you can put those stems in once you've got a lot of these leaves in. There's quite a mess of leaves, so you've got quite a lot you can pop in before you get those stems in. Just these, grab another brush, Caroline. There's one light one coming up here. And then there's some really dark ones over here too. So and build them up slowly. Like you can build them up slowly, and then you can put some more in if you don't have enough or they're too wet at the moment. And then you can put some stems in, and pretty soon you will have that mess that is the plant with leaves everywhere and some stems and so on and so forth. And it does help. I've got two brushes on the go here because there's some light leaves like these ones, and then there's some much darker ones. I've got a couple of brushes to help me out with those. And of course, if it's going over this river, not river, I guess mill pond and river, it's helpful to have them darker than the mill pond so that they show up. Even if they're not that dark on the picture, it just helps you. And you can always form, if you have your wet in wet flowers and you want to make them look more like flowers, you can form the edges of those flowers with your dark leaf colours. To make them look more flower-like. Oops. Now I've reversed my brushes, and my one that had the light colours on, I've now got dark paint on, so I'll put a bit more light colour on there. Now the leaves, they're quite a slow process, so we'll just do some of them. I won't have time to finish them all up today, but I want to kind of get to most of the stages of the painting before everybody has to go. I mean, you're welcome to stay, and I will try and get the video with all the finishing touches. Also, if you want a more browny green, if some of the greens you want them to be more earthy, you can add a little bit of burnt sienna to them if you need them a little bit more earthy. Let's do that with, just looking at these greens where I'm painting right now in the background back here. I've added a little bit of burnt sienna to that dark green, and I think that one back here needs to be a bit more earthy coloured. And in here there's quite a lot of indistinguishable shape going on. Yeah, so for those of you that are still hanging in there, I'm sorry it's been such a long one. We're basically getting close to finished. Of course, when this is dry, there'll be the washing out of the mill reflections. If you have a nice thin brush and some very dark paint, I'm going to add the magenta to the really dark paint and a little bit of burnt sienna, so it's pretty dark green, you know, so it's a sort of a browny magenta dark green. And one of the very, very last steps is to add a lot of these branches, so these connecting branches in the rhododendron. So there's quite a few of them, and they pull the whole thing together right at the end. I'm not going to put them all in because I still have a bit of work to do, but you know, there's one coming up here, and it comes out here, and one comes up here, and up here, and they kind of connect everything. There's a big one coming across here like that. You know, you can see some of the stems up here and over here. And once you get a few of those stems in as one of your very last things that you paint, kind of pulls everything together, and you can kind of see that it's a plant. Be one here and along here. I'm not going to put them all in because I haven't finished all my leaves. And if you get to the point where you don't know what to put between your leaves, you know, say you'll have all your leaves in, and you'll be like, okay, I've got white space between my leaves now. I got a flower there. Then just use some of your light green and brown watercolor. So I've got this light green here, and I can add a little bit of my brown watercolor to that color I've used for the mill pond to make it a kind of a browny green. And if you have spaces between things that you just need to fill up between these and the leaves, just put some of that browny green in there. I'm going to plop it in right now. And what I'll be doing is I'll be putting a few leaves over the top of that browny green. So what you're actually doing is you're putting this mill pond color that's between these, just between your leaves. If you've got white space with nothing in it, like, you know, what do I put in there? So just grab that sort of that mill pond color and just put it in any of those white spaces, and then have a few more leaves and a few branches coming over it, and it will all sort of go into the background for you. I'm just going to grab a little bit of my P.H. Martin's white. And another finishing touch that you'll want to do is the water coming down the water wheel. So if you have some white paint, the water is spilling over the top here, and then it's trickling down inside the water wheel. It's coming over the top here and spilling over here and coming out into the pond just here. And there's some trickle here too. So if you've got some white paint or a white, I've got a white pencil here, you can do some of that water with either white paint or white pencil or some gouache. And you can put that white in. The other place that there's some white in this painting, or not painting, in this photo, is to put these little white flowers. There's lots of little white flowers in this bush here. So you can add those with little dots of white and the reflections. And again, if you have a nice little white pastel pencil, it's not as bright as the P.H. Martin's white, but you can still get, you know, some nice little white flowers in the reflections and some trickles from the water. And even, I'm going to use my P.H. Martin's white. Over here by the wall, there's a few sort of very light reflections. So again, I'm going to go side to side in a horizontal way, and a little bit of a dry brush and my finger, and I'm going to put some reflections in there. We're almost done, but what I will do is after dinner, and this is a bit more dry, I will come back and I will film the last finishing touches of this. So I have a little bit more work to do to this. I've left it overnight to dry thoroughly because I want to do a little bit of washing out, and I need to finish the leaves in the background. So I have my 3 different greens here, and I'm going to use my number 4 brush and possibly my number 6 brush for some of the bigger leaves. We'll see. And I have quite a few of the dark ones in up here, so I'm going to put a medium green, which I've mixed with my regular Sap Green and a little bit of Ultramarine Blue to darken it up a little bit. I'm going to put some of these background ones in, a bit here. And I've got the stem in there. There's a little bit showing through here, a little bit of stem. Just those little extra details make it look more plant-like. And put a little bit of shading on this one. A bit more dark in there maybe. And I'm going to go to the really dark one, with the phthalo green and the magenta, and put some of these background ones in. And I wanted to let a lot of the lighter ones dry before I got some of these dark ones in. Otherwise, you just get everything bleeds together and you don't get sort of an individual look to some of the leaves. Once you get this mass of leaves in 2 or 3 different greens, it starts to look much more like a rhododendron bush. And of course there are some stems leading up to some of those light leaves that we did. Let's zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing a little better. I'm going to switch back and forth all the time between some different greens so they're not all the same. This is kind of my medium sap green I'm going for now. And the leaves are not all the same size either. You can, if you have some spaces that you don't know what to do with, you can invent some leaves if you think, oh my goodness, I've got a big space there, I don't know what to put in there. And of course there'll be some stems. The ones over here are very dark. I'm going to my very darkest green. And sometimes the leaf, of course goes behind a flower, so you can kind of make the edge of the flower and push the leaf behind it. That way you make your flowers stand out a little bit more, which is kind of nice. And to my, actually, no, I've got my, I'm going with my darker green. I'm looking at the reference photo, and these ones back here are very dark, so I'll go in with a darker green here. And the lovely thing about rhododendron leaves is they're very broad leaf, just, you know, what you think of as an iconic leaf shape. They're not hard to make. You don't have to really fuss with them too much. And if you have any spaces left when these are all dry, you can fill it up with just a little bit of light green or a splodge of pink from the flowers. It's easier to fill up a couple of those little spaces when you're done. I'm putting in a few extra dark ones here and there. And sometimes the ones that you did the day before may not be strong enough, so you might want to go in and fill in a couple of those. And gradually, you can see as I'm putting them in, they go behind some of the other ones. I'm taking sort of a medium green, and there's a little bit of a medium green back here. Grab a slightly lighter green. I'm going to put a bit of yellow with my Ultramarine Blue, which makes quite an opaque colour. The Ultramarine Blue and the yellow, they get a little opaque, but that's okay for these leaves in the background. Be fine. I can put some over the top of the pink. That will be fine too. And maybe a little bit behind one of these. I think some of these don't look quite strong enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more colour to them. It's like a puzzle. You have to sort of look at your reference photo and find your way around this puzzle. And the last thing will be to put in some stems. Anyway, you're not sure, just put some leaves in. If you think, oh, I don't know, don't quite know what to put there. I have drawn in quite a few. Putting the nice dark ones in here. There's a really dark one under here. I've got it quite dark, but I'm going to darken it a bit more. And I'm going to invent a couple of stems back there, because the photo doesn't give a lot of detail. And a bit of shadow on this leaf. See, it's just the same colour as I had before, but I'm adding a second layer. I don't want it quite such a harsh line in the middle, so I'm getting my wet brush and just softening that with a slightly wet brush. These ones have a little bit of shadow on from the flowers, so I just put a bit of that on. It has some shadow in the back. Trying to have a good look at what's going on here. I've got those stems in. Let's keep having another look at my... there is a stem. Let's move this over a little bit. There's a stem that comes right up here. Pop that in. Dark leaves. A bit of dark here. This is a bit more dark coming out here, so I'm going to darken that up a little bit. kind of like this bit where I'm getting all these nice dark leaves in behind the flowers. And some stems. Right in the middle of these flowers here, there's a bit of green showing here. Go for a slightly medium green here. I have quite a bit put in there. I think I need, this is a little bland over here, so I think I need a little bit more just here. And I won't do any more to the connecting stems for the moment. Let's pull back and have a look at that in total, so you can have a see of what's going on. Now, what I want to do now is I want to use my little scrubbing out brush to get some of those reflections out. And starting with the reflection from the green, I just want to lift that a little bit so it's not quite as dark. And of course I want the top of the wall, so I'm just lifting that a little bit. And we have the struts from the mill, what's holding all of the mill wheel, sort of. And you can see a little bit here. Some of it's not as visible and some is more visible. So some I wet quite a lot and others I don't. And often reflections are much longer than the actual item that you're reflecting. They go straight down into the water, or in the case of this crossbar, of course they reflect the angle that it's at. And the other thing I'm going to do is some horizontal reflections, because that looks like the reflections on the top of the water, and there's some quite light reflections on the top of this water, so I'm going to put those in. Just so all I'm doing is I'm getting clean water on my little scrubby brush, making a sort of a horizontal brush stroke, and then swiping with my Kleenex. And you need it to be really dry to do this. And the side of the wheel and the building seem to be reflecting too. I'm just looking at the photo by Susan Roque here. Beautiful photo, Susan. Thank you. Susan has been so gracious about me using her photos. Just really appreciate it when photographers who take beautiful photos are happy to let us watercolorists use them. I'm not great at taking photos, so it's lovely when I can find someone who is really good. I can use their expertise. Just make sure I get everything. There's quite a bit of reflection on the water just here. And it looks so much more reflective like water once you get some of these reflections in. Now, the reason this is so easy is because this is mostly burnt sienna, which doesn't stain, and I put a little bit of ultramarine blue in to darken it up, and that doesn't stain either. So that makes all of this pulling the colour off again very easy. And there is a point where you have to stop, or you're going to lose all of your colour that you have on there, and you'll distress your paper too much. So I think mine has got to the point where I've got enough taken off. I might put a little bit more of the white flowers back in when that's dry, but of course if I do it now, it's going to be damp and that won't work at all. The only thing I really need to do now is maybe add a little bit more magenta to some of the foreground flowers. I'm going to grab a little bit of magenta, watered down this time now. We used it full strength when we did wet on wet, but the paper's dry now. So I'm going to add a little bit of shadow inside these florets with some watered down magenta. And you only need to do this if you feel that you want a bit more colour, especially on the foreground ones. Like you want to add just a little bit more depth of colour. And again, I'm looking at the reference photo, not so much for anything except shape of where these darker parts are. Not really trying to make flowers or anything, just what's the shape of these darker parts in the foreground here. I'm popping a little bit of colour on, damp brush, easing it out so it doesn't look too different to the wet in wet that I have on there. These are a little bit darker on the inside. And you can see how much it's lightened up from what I had when it was wet to now a day later when it's had time to dry. Even those really deep magenta colours have lightened up. So that's why I'm just putting a little bit of extra on there. Very, very loosely. I'm not trying to make this too structured. A little bit of water each time I do that. The inside of this one's quite dark, so I'm going to go inside of there, a little bit of dark. That way I can form the top of the bell shape. And I do know that if I do too much of this, it's going to be too much, too overwhelming for the painting. So what I'm doing is I'm filling in a few of these little white spaces here and there with a little bit of magenta so that there's something in the white space. And now we're almost finished. Back here there's still a little bit of white space behind these leaves. Oh, and I haven't done the stems yet, so I'm going to take quite a light green, and in some of these little spaces, now don't forget there's a grey stone bridge back here, so I'm not going to put anything there, but just in a few of these spaces, taking that light green and just popping that in where there's nothing much showing. And I've got that light green on my brush, so I want to do just a little bit. I know I've pulled back some colour from here, so that's why I'm going to be very delicate with my horizontal brush strokes. And I'm going to put a little bit of the light green reflection back in, going horizontally, so I've got a nice variety there. Now we're just about finished, not much more left to do. Might do a little bit of shadow on that leaf, a bit of light green in there. Sometimes you miss something really obvious, so you have to double check everywhere. And I want to get my smallest round brush, my number 2. I'm not going to go right down to my really thin liner brush because the stalks are, What we're talking about are, let's zoom in a little bit more. There we go. What I'm talking about are all these stalks that go in between the leaves and come up to the flowers on this bush. So especially sort of here, look at this really big one down here. So I want to get those in to connect everything. This is kind of interesting one here too. So I have my really dark green, which is the phthalo green and the magenta. This is my one here. I'm going to add a bit more magenta to that. And I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's grey to that. A bit more magenta, actually a little bit of burnt sienna. I want it to be a browny, greeny, burgundy colour there. A little bit more phthalo green. And we've got a lovely sort of browny, greeny, burgundy colour, which is going to be great for those stems that I want to put in as the very final touch. And what I want to have is this here, because I don't want the stems to look weird or unnatural or in the wrong place. I kind of want to have them looking like they would be doing what they're doing. So start small and start up in this corner up here. And like I said, there's this one that comes out 3 times, like this kind of a weird shape. There's actually one sort of sticking out there. Now they don't have to come in front of everything. They can go behind things. It's really nice if they go behind things actually. And some of these leaves, of course, are attached. Well, of course, most of them are, but you can't see that most of them are attached to these stems that are everywhere. Sometimes you need a light touch, and sometimes, like with the stem I'm going to do here, it's quite a thick stem, so I'm going to push my brush down a little bit and get a thicker stroke. This one comes out here, and there's one coming out here. And this is where you get some sense of dimension or perspective too, is you have these little buildings in the background and bushes, but then you've got these big stems in the foreground, so that makes things look, it makes the plant look close and it makes the building look further away. So that's really going to help with your sense of perspective, having something like that in the foreground. There's actually one that comes in front of that leaf there, and a big one through there. I'm going to pull back so you can see the whole thing. And I'm thinking about where the next one is that I see. It's a big one. Oh, it's wet there. I have to be careful. Like, I'm not pausing to dry my leaves, and I probably should. I'll put a couple more in, and then I'm going to pause and dry my leaves really thoroughly so that I can go over the top of dry leaves. That seems like a good point to just pause for a moment. There, so I had a little run over with my hairdryer so that I can work on nice dry leaves. And there's a couple of other things I want to do too. Let's try and get control of my camera. I want to get some of the highlights on the rhododendron leaves. Remember, I put the nice strong paint in first, and then I want to wet that really strong paint and pull off some highlights, because this leaf, especially in the photo, was reflecting a lot of light. This one has a little bit of highlight. This one does too. This has a little bit. And remember we had this one over here. I pulled some highlight back on that one. I actually have a little bit too much colour on this one. I'm going to take a bit more off. And let's see where else is quite a highlighted leaf. A little bit here. And that's about it for ones that are shining in the sunshine. There's just one over here. I can barely see it. And then I've got those highlighted, and I can continue to put on the branches with the darker paint. So there's this, I started this one the other day and popped that in. And there's a big thick one behind that. What you can see here is the masking tape, so I don't need to worry about that too much. Lifting my brush up a bit so I get some thinner branches in there. And this kind of goes through here. There's quite a mass of them under there. I'm not going to put them all in, that's too much to do. I'm just going to put enough in to give an idea of what's going on. Some of them I'm going to do darker than they actually are, so that you can kind of see what's happening. I'm just going to get a little darker paint. This leaf's quite dark. I just want to make that a little darker. And this one's under the shade of the other one. This one's quite dark. And in between the flowers, you can sometimes see a bit of stem or leaf. So I'm just popping a little bit of that in, just here and there. I've got that big. There's another one. That one comes down here, goes across here. And that kind of goes back here. I'm going to get the lighter green now because this stem coming up here is lighter. So I'm going to use a lighter green for that, sort of the medium to light. And back to the dark, because in here, behind all these, quite a mass of like I say, you can't always get them all in, but you do your best. I'm going to pull back so you can see a little bit more from a distance what I'm doing. I'm just getting to the point where I'm thinking I might, there's a curly one here, might be almost ready to kind of stop what I'm doing. As long as you give that suggestion of all those stems back there, nobody's going to come and count them. And put a few of these leaves in a little stronger. And behind some of these it's quite dark, so I'm going to put a little bit more dark in behind some of them. Corners, I especially like to get corners nice and dark, so it stops the eye in the corner. I've got a little bit of my medium dark green in there. Now, if I was going for a truly realistic picture, I'd spend a lot of time on this, but I'm not. I'm going for kind of an impressionistic rhododendron bush with not too much fuss happening. I'll put that in a little darker behind there. What I do want to do is balance. I want to have some balance with the darks. So I'm going to take a look at how much dark I have over on the left and how much dark I have over on the right, and then I'm going to see if I need to add any more anywhere to make it more balanced. We've got dark behind the Waterwheel. We have I'm going to put a little bit more dark in the ivy back here, just to give a little bit of dimension there. A little bit more dark in these bushes here. It's much easier to do now they're dry, of course. And under these grasses, get my light green and maybe put a few more grasses in the reflection. Didn't get enough probably first time round. Got good dark back here and behind these bushes. It is a bit darker under here. So with some bubbly sort of strokes and not too much fuss, I'm going a little bit darker just here. And what I didn't like was one place this dried up too quickly. I didn't have the light green wet enough. Now, I'm not going to use my scrubby brush because I don't want to scrub the colour out. I'm going to use my soft, that's my number 8. I'm just going to try and lighten up that line a little bit so it's not quite so hard in there. It's already scrubbing a bit too much off. I don't want it quite that harsh. I'm trying to kind of manipulate that a little bit, get a little bit of shape to the tree. It's not quite as a hard line. So you have to be really gentle. I've got very soft brush, gentle strokes, just taking a little bit of paint off. It's getting a little bit more shape. I'm going to get a little bit of yellow. I've got a little bit of yellow and green, and because I took a little bit too much paint off, I'm just going to add a little bit more in so it doesn't look white. Just want a soft edge there. Okay, and I think we're just about done. I'll pull back again. And let's get my very tiny brush, my 0, and a little bit of the white. My Dr. P.H. Martin's white. Now, this is the one I use. Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. It comes in a little pot, lasts you for absolutely years. You use it with water and a small brush, and it is a watercolour paint, so it's still watercolour. And I did do a little bit of this yesterday, but I'm going to do a little bit more. Now it's nice and dry. A little bit more water flowing over the water wheel. A little bit more white. You need such a small amount of the white, but you need to get it just diluted perfectly on your tiny brush. And oops, and that's too wet now. It's quite thick in the pot, so you need to add a little bit of water, but if you make it too wet, then you lose control of it. So I want to get this water pouring down between these spokes on the water wheel and coming down, and it's pouring down into the mill pond, coming from up there. And I want to do a little bit of extra white where it's coming out into the mill pond here. A little bit of reflection. And remember I put that Ultramarine Blue in there, and that's to form shadows behind this water. I'm going to make that post is quite bright in the sunshine. Just going to brighten that up a little bit. And this one. There is a little swan in the picture. I'm just not going to put that in. I think I'll ruin my picture if I try and put a swan in. And then this bush here, this wildflower plant, has quite a lot of little white flowers. I'm just dotting. I've got my number 0 brush. I'm just dotting those in. And of course they have reflections as well in the water, which is kind of nice. Gives some nice relief to all that brown. And I'm going to try and follow, of course, if I've got white flowers here, I want white flowers underneath. I don't want it to be too... And I can do a couple of little horizontal lines because they always indicate water. Some horizontal reflections. A couple here. There's some quite reflective water back here, so I'm just going to put those little horizontal reflective lines in, maybe a few more. You can see a few more from the good dry brush from the buildings, and the stone wall over here too is reflecting quite light in the water. So I'm going to put a little bit of dry brush over here, just a little tiny bit. It just all helps to make it look like water, and that's our goal with these lessons, is to, so your reflections in the water, they go straight down. Reflections of light on the top of the water, the ripples, they go horizontally. And dry brush is always helpful for those. Let's zoom out again. And then I think that is as much as I would want to do to this painting. It's done, I think. Our goal was to try and do it in 2 hours. We didn't achieve that, I'm afraid. It's quite a complex one. I think 3 hours is more like your mark, and definitely I think leaving it overnight to dry is very advisable. It really helps to work on a lovely dry painting. So I might just put, there's always one more thing. I always look and there's always one more thing and I want to do. I'm just maybe going to put a little bit more colour just on some of those in here, just a tiny bit. And I'm gonna, one more thing, I'm gonna get some rose. There's a bit more colour on these ones just up on the corner here. And again, corners, I like to block them off for the eye. I just put a little bit more there. I really don't do much more than a splodge with the side of my brush. It's not a, and a little bit of rose. So there we go. Let's take the masking tape off gently, because you don't want to rip your paper. Go gently sideways. Now I did stretch this paper. It is taped down with the brown gummed tape, and it's remained perfectly flat, which has made painting absolute joy. It's Arsh 40-pound cold pressed paper, my favourite to paint on. And that's cleaned up the edge of that there. And you may say, well, now what do you do? How do you get it off of the board? Well, I use a craft knife. I'm grabbing my craft knife. I like a metal ruler. You can get these metal rulers anywhere. I can get them in Dollarama, the art store, the Staples, the stationery store. And I can see the edge of my paper just here. So I'm going to put my knife where I can see the edge of the paper. Let's make a little mark there as well. Make sure your painting's dry, absolutely thoroughly dry. And I know mine's not. I shouldn't be doing this, but I want to just show you what to do. So a couple of pulls with my craft knife, and I've got that edge open. If you want to, if it's easier, I'm going to grab a pencil, and I'm just going to mark where the side of my tape is with the pencil, so I can see it, my ruler, and I don't have to put my ruler on my painting. And then I can come down that side. Usually one pass with a good sharp craft knife will do it. And I'm going to mark the edge of my paper. Now I make my paper an inch wider and an inch longer than I need it, and I have a ½ an inch on every edge, because a ½ an inch really holds your paper on well. Be gentle as you pull that up. You have to just switch it around a little bit. And the last edge. There. Now, I got a perfectly flat, beautifully flat piece of paper. To frame that will be an absolute dream, because it's not going to buckle. I'm going to show you how to prepare your board for next time. Let's put my knife away. Oh, there's my painting. Now here's my board with the tape on it, and this is paper tape with a water activated gum on the back. So I buy a whole packet of these little sponges, these cellulose sponges. They're nice, they hold a lot of water. I usually cut them in half. I've got some water here. And to get this tape off of the board, I'm going to get that soaked sponge, and I'm going to soak that tape with it, and probably leave it for ½ an hour or so, and then soak the tape again, or leave it for 15 minutes and come back and have a go with it. All of these supplies, pretty much everything, can be got in a dollar store. Now I have several types of palette knife. Now you can get a pack of palette knives in Dollarama. I've seen them for a couple of bucks. And you can also get, in most dollar stores, a pack of these plastic knives for $1.25. So you can get either one that you want. Now if you leave this tape for about ½ an hour, I've only just put the water on, so it's not going to come off really well. But if you leave it for about ½ an hour, it will go very tacky, and you can get a palette knife underneath it when it's wet. And like I say, I've only just wet this, so it's not going to work very well. I'm just doing this to show you. But when you've soaked it for a while, you can put a palette knife or a butter knife underneath it, and you can just ease it off. Now, of course, mine's not coming off very well. It's not wet enough yet. But once it's soaked for a while, it will be wet enough to just peel off of that board, easily. I'm going to take a bit off by hand and then wet it up. Then I'll soak it for a while. See, I've wetted up enough to pull some of that back. Now, if you don't want to clean up your board for next time, you don't have to, but I find if I want to put a different size paper on, it's often handy to have the board cleaned up. You don't want brown tape staining your watercolor paper or the acid from the glue staining your watercolor paper. Your watercolor paper is acid-free, pH balanced, and you want to try and keep it that way. Not have anything touching it that's going to make it acidic. So you can see, even without soaking it for long, I can get off a good amount of that. And then when I'm all done, when everything's peeled off and scraped off, then wash off the glue with some plain water, let it dry, and you're ready to use your board again. I put 2 coats of white gesso on here because, again, that protects your watercolor paper from the acid that might be in the wood. Some woods, like the boards that I bought from Dollarama, they are quite good quality wood, not very acidic, but this is just an old piece of plywood, and all of this brown and this acid from the wood will leach into your watercolor paper when it's wet. So protect it with 2 or 3 coats of gesso, clear, white gesso, or whatever gesso you want, and the tape will stick well to the gesso and it will protect your paper. Don't use varnish, the tape won't stick to the varnish. Don't use oil paint or a glossy paint or any type of house paint, because it will be too glossy for the brown tape. Gesso is like calcium carbonate with a flat white latex paint and a bit of glue mixed in that is made specially, and it will, you can see the brown tape has stuck to it really, really well. Although with a little bit of water, look, it's coming off, even though I haven't left it for long. So there we are. That's how you get your paper off of your board. And usually, I've lost my, there it is, I lost it. Usually, before I frame, I will cut this edge off so that I don't have any brown tape, because I'm worried that over time, the brown from the tape will leach into the watercolor and it will start to go brown. So I will cut this off before I frame. Don't try and soak it off of here, because if you try and soak it off of here, it's all going to buckle all over again, and you'll have this buckly, wavy piece of paper, and you'll be like, oh no, I had a flat piece of paper and now it's all buckled. So don't try and soak it off, just trim it off with a knife, and make sure that your mat that you're framing with goes over the top of your edges. So always make your paper a little bit bigger than your frame and your mat opening, so that all of this can be hidden behind the mat. And if you don't know what I mean by a mat, some people are not sure what I mean by a mat. I'm just trying to see if I've got one handy. Probably haven't got one handy, but it's a piece of card with an opening in. I've got some that are the wrong size, but what I mean by a mat is a piece of card with an opening in, so that you can put your painting behind it. Of course, I wouldn't use this size. That's all I have handy, and I wouldn't use that colour either. But that's what I mean by a mat. So again, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now. Well, thank you again for joining me and painting with me. I know this was a long one. I don't mind if you fast forward or get bored, but if you are painting along, I know it's helpful to be able to pause and come back to it from time to time. And if you didn't get finished with me on Zoom the other day, then I hope you did manage to get finished. Thank you again for joining me, and we'll be back in the fall with some more lessons. Bye for now.